So ladies and gentlemen, after that thought-provoking session, it's time to move on to the next session, which is going to be our last session for the day. The name of the session is Boards of the Future, Change with Continuity. With changes taking place at a rapid pace, will today's boards continue to be relevant? What should the boards of the future look like? The panelists for the session are Mr. Jay Kotak, Mr. Jay Kotak, who is the co-head of Kotak 811 and Senior Vice President of Conglomerate Relationships, Kotak Mahindra Bank. He plays a pivotal role in shaping the bank's digital retail strategy. As SVP for Conglomerate Relationships, he works closely with India's most ambitious business groups as they diversify into emerging sectors. Under him, Kotak 811 has grown into a major engine of growth for the bank. In the financial year 2024, it accounted for 72% of all new savings accounts, expanding its user base to 23.6 million. Deposits and transactions rose to 38% and 52% respectively. And prior to joining Kotak Mahindra, he worked with McKinsey and Goldman Sachs. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kotak. Our next panelist for the session is Mr. Nawshir Mirza. He was a senior partner with S.R. Batliboi and Company, where he served in various leadership roles in audit and assurance domains. He was deputy chairman of the British Business Group, the chair being traditionally occupied by a British national. He was also the country head for Jardine Matheson for 10 years. Currently, he is an independent director on several reputed boards. He is deeply involved in the movement of improved governance in companies and in improved accounting practices. He is also associated with several philanthropic initiatives such as the Indian Red Cross. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mirza. Our next panelist for the session is Mr. Siddarth Pai. Mr. Siddarth Pai is the founding partner, CFO, and ESG officer of 314 Capital. He is the youngest executive council member of the Indian Venture Capital Association, IFCA, the apex body for Indian funds investing into alternative assets. He also serves as the co-chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee, working on matters related to security markets, alternative investment funds, taxation, foreign exchange, law, and startups. He is an expert policy member of the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable, iSpirit, a Bangalore-based think tank, and is a part of the Startup Council of CII and IMA. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pai.
Thank you.
And our moderator for the session is going to be Mr. Mirza. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, friends, and thank you for staying back, those of you who remain here, because it is the last session. We have a very interesting topic, because we are going to be doing what a board of a company is expected to do, peer into the future. That is strategy. That's the very core of a company's business. And we are not going to look at the strategy for a company, but what the panel has been asked by Mr. Damodaran to do is to look into what the boards of the future are likely to be like, or even more than that, because our abilities to predict something into the future are limited, but certainly what we would like to see in the future in a good board. And for that, Mr. Damodaran has put together a panel in which there are two individuals who are the future, and a guy who is long past. And they're both younger than my daughter is. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to do here, except that Churchill famously said, the further forward you want to look, the further backward you should see. So in other words, the past does help you to predict into the future. Not always, but in a general way. He, of course, himself didn't take his advice and lost the election after winning the war for the very survival of his country. So having said that, they say change is a constant. They say change is a constant, and it's a favorite saying of all business leaders that change is a constant. So we are going to see what the three of us think is likely to be the change in the future, or what is the change we'd like to see in the future, and maybe as a little aside, and if we have the time, what we'd like to see continue into the future. What are the good things we have? And there are good things. It's not to be critical to say we're in a bad state. In fact, we met just before this session upstairs, and we all agree that things are pretty satisfactory. They can always be better, and that's what we'll talk about. But it's not to say things are critical, things are serious. So with that, I'll start by requesting Sid to give us his opening remarks, after which Jai will do that.
I think, so I think anyone who's actually been coming to any of the Gatekeepers and governance conferences would know very well what a board is supposed to do, and also know very well what a board is not actually supposed to do, for that matter. I think the only issue that the industry has is actually putting theory into practice, which I think is remnant of a large number of any sort of system that actually exists. I think what we are seeing in governance as of now, and one of the fairly more recent trend as of now, is this active substitution of governance through compliance. I think compliance has actually become a byword now for governance as of now. And if you've actually seen the format of the board reports, annual reports, and what's actually coming in, there's a large amount of activity, but it's very hard to discern the achievement that it ends up actually creating. In a sense, it's harder to discern the wheat from the chaff that actually gets done. We've reached a situation now wherein I think attendance has now become a substitute for oversight. The board has a role to end up actually directing and governing the company, holding management up to account, being a foil to some of the assumptions of what CEOs need to CEO and the management and the calls they end up actually taking, and to actually represent the voices not just of equity shareholders, but of various stakeholders also on the same. But the only way to discern that as of now is either through media interviews or through books that have actually been written well after the fact. If you were to go through the annual reports and the current state of reporting as of now, it actually is similar to what we used to go through at school. You've attended, these were the number of working days, here's the number of board meetings you've actually attended. What transpired in those board meetings, what did you contribute, those things are actually absent as of now. We've also seen, I think, over time, as a similar line to this, a preponderance of independence actually coming in and playing a much stronger role when it comes to companies as a whole. I think there's an active thought process with the regulator, whether it's right or not for that matter is actually up for debate, is that the more independent a person is and the less of a pecuniary relationship they have with the company, the better they are to end up actually governing the future of that particular company itself. I think that's where we enter into two fundamental issues with behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. One is the moment it fails the adage, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. If there is no incentive for the person to end up actually acting, or they are divorced from the financial consequences of the actions they end up actually taking, can they really have the best interests of all the shareholders in mind? I think that's actually first and foremost. The second thing that also ends up actually coming up with the independence, with the preponderance of independent directors, is the hampering of their ability to truly behave independently. I think every 5 years, the independent directors need to end up actually getting reinstated or reappointed back to the board. And if a independent director is truly independent, the chances of them actually coming back to the board actually goes away. Because the promoter, who is normally a majority shareholder, will actually say that, look, I don't want this troublemaker actually sitting on my side and eating my head 12 times a year. I'd rather not have that person over there itself. So it creates the best independent directors actually run the risk of not actually coming back to their own companies. It's a classic principal and agent problem. So we are seeing, and I think the consequences of this are actually rife. Some of the scams that have actually happened over the last few years as well, you have actually seen that they have actually had strong audit committees, they've had controls that actually look the same on paper, they've had independent directors sign off on all their reports, etc. Yet fairly large irregularities have actually transpired in these kind of businesses. on the same. So the independence, or rather the fig leaf that the regulators have put in place as of now, that independence is first and foremost and one of the only criteria for a director to end up happening, does end up actually getting fairly flawed. And that is something I believe that actually deserves to end up actually changing in the future, similar to the role that governance and compliance comes in. Now, what are the costs that end up actually coming in? I think we as a people are not fully, we may not be fully able to internalize or have the appetite to end up actually facing the cost of actually trying to reform these kind of fundamental ideals that now become part of the governance, corporate governance architecture of the entire nation. For market forces to actually survive, they have, in the words of author Schopenhauer, need to actually undergo creative destruction. The destruction element is as important as the creation element that ends up actually coming in. But the consequences of destruction are not only felt by the directors, the board, or the company. It's actually felt by the employees, shareholders, and actually society at large. But every time there are these sort of major dysfunctions, every time one of these large companies end up actually falling, the market learns, the market understands, the market reacts, the market adapts. And then the market ends up actually putting into place systems to ensure that these kind of issues don't end up actually coming about. And even though the regulator plays an outsized role about trying to change the regulations, and hopefully we'll speak about some of the regulatory reactions that have ended up actually shaping corporate governance and the boards and what the boards need to end up actually doing. I think we are actually seeing a situation where the need for market forces to end up actually playing a stronger role does actually come in. And there is a transitionary provision, of course. We're still in a semi-controlled economy, slowly hoping to make its way to actually a fully mature and a developed economy as well. But we are in a crossroads as of now where India has the aspirations of a $10 trillion economy, but the regulations of a $500 billion economy. There is a fundamental dissonance between the aspirations of people, the ability for them to end up actually operating, as well as the regulations that assumes that fundamental market forces, basic behavioral economics has no role to actually end up playing in the way boards are actually governed. So I think these are some of the changes, these are some of the issues we end up actually seeing now. In the question of continuity versus what has to change in the future, these are some of the elements that do actually require a look, they require debate. Some of these may not actually change. I think we may not actually be ready for that change as well, but having the conversation is actually the first part.
Thanks, Jai. Thanks. That's very, very useful.
So, good evening. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Damodaran sir for thinking of having me here today. I am a student of history, and I'd like to apply some historical context to this whole idea of governance, because that's really why we're here. A board is, at the end of the day, a champion of the larger theme of governance. Over the last 2,000 years, since the Roman Empire fell till 1945, the world operated largely in a might is right kind of framework, a great man or a power comes first framework. And that's really most of what happened. And then we had the Second World War, and out of that came something very different from the past, which is a concept of institution-based governance. Global institutions like the World Bank, the Red Cross, the IMF, the United Nations came, sponsored by a global order and a superpower. In many ways, in a 2,000-year history since the Roman Empire, it's been 60 or 70 years, and that could indeed be the blip. And it is possible that at a global order level, we are reverting to the mean, which is less governance, more might makes right. And it is in this context globally that while the world is having a fraying of institutions and governance, that India is growing, and India needs the right framework of governance even more now than ever before. And I think that the boards in India are only a manifestation of some of this larger concept of how to balance this idea. As somebody who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, some of these institutions always struck us as great and infallible. Again, whether you think about the United Nations or the World Bank. And today, I don't think the next gen quite feels that way. But in India, the Reserve Bank or SEBI or many of our other great institutions still, I believe, command some of that respect, as do boards in their individual capacity, at least of great companies. And we have to fight and hold to cherish that. And I'm open to having, a larger and more fruitful discussion, but that's really how I feel about the world today.
Thanks, Jay. Actually, you said you're a student of history. Now that makes two of us. And I don't know how many people here are interested in history. But taking a cue from what you've said and what my perspective is, and I won't go back to the Holy Roman Empire and think as far back as that, but if you just go back to what I have always believed is corporate governance has been designed looking at political governance. And what I mean by that is that, see, till the 11th century, as he said, the great man figure or the king was absolute. And then we had King John in England, who was a nasty king, and his barons fought against him, and finally they got him to sign the Magna Carta. And about 100 years after the Magna Carta was signed, for the first time, the king conceded to others a say in the governance of their nation. And who did he concede that power to? He conceded it to a parliament, and the parliament had three components. The first component was the barons, because the barons gave him the soldiers to fight his wars. The king couldn't have remained in power without them. He gave it to the bishops and the clergy because they gave him legitimacy. A king is the representative of God on earth. And who could confirm that? The priests. And he gave it to the large cities because they gave him certain taxes. So it was a transaction, as Sid mentioned. They gave him something, he gave something back in return. And then, 31st December 1600, the first company was chartered, the East India Company, it happens to be, by the first Queen Elizabeth. And the same transactional model was put in place. You give capital to the company, you receive the right to have a say in governance. And since then, it is 425 years since that happened, that is still the structure. There is no change. That's why I facetiously said in the beginning, business leaders talk about change is constant. We see no change here. But there was a change in the political governance model. Because when the American Revolution and the French Revolution happened, for the first time, the king acknowledged, or was forced to acknowledge, that the say in governance should go to those who are affected by governance, which means a vote to everybody. It took some time. Women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote. But the concept that it is not a transaction to have a voice in governance. When you're in governance, the purpose of governance is to be of service to those your governance is going to affect. And they must have a say in that governance. It didn't come in, and this happened 200 years ago in France and America, and democracy swept the world after that. It hasn't come in our business world at all. And he made a mention of the Second World War. After the Second World War, a lot of more liberal thinking came across the world, swept across the world. Equity, fairness, stuff like that. And right about the year 2000, when Kofi Annan set up that committee, which coined this strange collection of terms, ESG, for the first time we had an acknowledgement that stakeholders need to be addressed by companies, because ESG was stakeholders. Then we later had DEI and all of these things. Now, Sid and Jay, both of you, what we see now is, and Jai made a reference to it. The strongmen are coming back. In America it's happened in our own country. You cannot question the man at the top. You cannot question the chairman of the board or the promoter. He is the big man in the company. Independent institutions are being undermined. In America, we see that openly and brazenly. We see it in many other countries, probably even in ours. So, are we going to see a regression, having advanced only a little? We still haven't sorted out. The politicians gave a vote to everybody, however reluctantly, they gave it. Are companies prepared to give a vote not only to the shareholders, to the vendors, to the employees, to the community, to future generations, all of whom are affected by a company's behavior? Are we going to see that change? I am not as you get older, you become a skeptic, you become a cynic. That is one of the consequences of becoming old, because you see everything and nothing changes. You become a cynic. But these are young people. So I pose the question to both of them also. And since you're a lover of history like I am, what is your view? Not just on my question, but on the broader issue of changes, but even this question, if you will take it.
When you say change, you mean change in
No,
governance in India?
Yeah, are we going to see a regression? You see, we have got now this ESG and stuff has begun to be accepted. We have the BRSR report. Those kind of things have happened. In America, companies are scrambling to erase DEI and ESG from their websites and their public pronouncements.
I think in some ways, in terms of the maturity of our system, to not get prone to ideological capture, the Indian system is a little more resilient than the American system in that context. Mm-hmm. I spent some time in the US. I got my undergraduate and master's degrees in the US between 2007, 11 and then 15, 17. And in the span of 2-3 years, the zeitgeist of what people consider appropriate or inappropriate changes completely. When I was in business school, there was no concept of pronouns in 2015, 16, 17. Yet by 2020, every single student in business school had the pronoun in front, and all companies were scrambling. And now today we are back in a position where absolutely nobody would be having pronouns in business school today. India is a little more like an elephant in that sense, and I think that that's a good thing.
Good thing, yeah.
So at an overarching level, I think governance itself is an art, not a science. You're always balancing on a fence between catering to the stakeholders in an individual sense, which is a government catering to its voters in their individual needs, versus doing what is right for the system and for the long term. And I would say the same about boards, and I'm cautiously optimistic with certain caveats and many things you absolutely need to fix in India, that relative to the mean of where the world is going in governance, which in my view is an undoubted degradation, year on year on year on as a global average, India has some hope to stand out. If we do it for long enough, a few decades, then people actually come and respect our institutions.
Yeah, then they'll copy us.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll
I think we're some way away from that, but aspirationally.
Yeah, good. Siddharth, apart from the point I made, and you don't have to necessarily, one of the things you said, and I think that's a very, very fundamentally important point. And every conference you go to now that they've stopped asking the question, are independent directors really independent? Because it's a chestnut in every conference. Everyone, now they've stopped asking it, thank God. So what can be done? You said align incentives.
No.
So what kind of alignment of incentive would you like to see? Not necessarily independent directors, nothing great about independent directors. So that directors on the board, independent, not independent, whatever, act in the long-term interests of the company.
Yeah. No, I think that is actually a fantastic question. So I'll answer that, and I would actually like to answer the first question you also brought up.
Thanks.
I think, see, a large amount of this boils down to transparency also as of now. We have a large amount of information, a lot of noise, but very few signals actually coming out of annual reports also as of now. In fact, I think if even in audit committees, I don't know about the public companies, but we definitely see this in the private company space, even something as simple as revenue recognition, for example, is a massive topic of debate. And there have been numerous startups who have actually failed diligence, ended up shutting shop because no one could actually agree how revenue actually had to be recognized. You said it, not me. But yes, so there have been numerous companies this way who've actually ended up suffering these kind of issues as of now. Now, to ask yourself, the question is, why are we actually end up in this state? Running a business is supposed to be fairly simple. In fact, one of the Stephen Graham adages on investing is supposed to be as boring as actually watching paint dry, for that matter. But you open any finance textbook as of now, I think you do actually need a minor in Latin to end up actually going through all the Greeks they end up actually throwing at you for that matter itself, even though I'm mixing up two different civilizations for the sake of that joke. I think a large amount boils down to two simple aspects. One is simplicity, the other is transparency. We have, in the guise of transparency, we've given such a massive amount of information overload that the information asymmetry that exists between shareholders and management actually continues. The boards, a large number of these annual reports, a number of annual reports also from what I've heard are unfortunately written by consultants as of now. It's ChatGPT before the era of ChatGPT actually began. It's volumes and volumes and volumes of information with almost impossible to figure out what actually happens. And we use euphemisms, bywords, content, etc. DEI, ESG, if you ask me, all of these represent strong fundamental attributes of good governance or running a good company. But as of now, they've actually become like marketing terms for that matter. I think every time there's a new coinage that's actually termed, every consultant is now a master in that, and suddenly everyone has 15 years experience in all these particular elements. So the simplicity of running a business and the transparency that's actually needed is actually fundamentally eroded as of now. And that's a consequence of two separate events that end up actually happening. One is an unfortunate substitution of enforcement by regulation. So every time something bad happens for that matter, regulators, and not just Indian regulators, but regulators across the world, genuinely believe that this is a prevalent problem. It may not be a one-off issue. Therefore, let's actually change the rules for everyone. So someone who is actually running a fairly sound and solid business now has to end up actually jumping through hoops and hoops just to end up understanding and articulating what they end up actually running as part of their business as of now. So that's the part when it comes to, and the people who end up actually running badly run businesses, they just end up actually drowning you with tons of information in the guise of transparency. I think some of these, what has been mandated as of now is not actually required. A private company or a company for that matter, at the end of the day, is actually a compact between the management as well as the shareholders who end up actually existing. They should decide the rules of what sort of transparency they want, how much information they want from the management, to what degree the information has to end up actually coming back as of now. Those are the actual principles which have unfortunately now been diluted by a large amount of prescription that ends up actually coming in. The next is a part of simplicity. I think it's fundamentally hard for a number of, even the analyst calls for that matter, what we said in a few words ends up actually taking paragraphs upon paragraphs. We've seen verbal diarrhea actually substitute what is supposed to be the wisdom of management. And that's actually there. So some of these elements are taken by people who look at it and say, oh, this person's actually spoken for so long in their conference, fantastic, or so long in their analyst call, fantastic, he must actually know what's happening in the business. So these are the kind of unfortunate substitutes that have actually ended up coming in as of now. And they make it genuinely hard to end up actually understanding a business, genuinely hard to end up actually running a business. Yeah. And some of these are reactions to changes in regulation, where we can't end up catching a person, so let's actually change the rules for everyone. And becomes an easier way where we prescribe so much that has to be done, the principles are actually lost.
Yeah, but Siddarth, my question was the point you made. Alignment of incentives.
I'm coming to that. So, therefore, the alignment of incentives has to come back to the fundamental compact that actually underpins the business. Now, look, shareholders at the end of the day, any decision taken by the company usually has one of three consequences. It moves the share price up, it moves the share price down, it has no effect on the share price. I think we're actually seeing lesser of the last part and more of actually the first two. Now, it's fairly obvious that the shareholders actually have the ability to end up actually changing management whenever management actually does something wrong. There are a number of activist investors, a larger amount of capital and private equity that exists, whose fundamental job is to find badly run businesses, buy out the existing management, make a case to the existing shareholders, and take over the management of what happens. But we make it so hard to do that in this country as of now. It's such a long drawn and laborious process that the incumbents in these businesses know that it's almost impossible to end up actually throwing them out unless they assume they do something catastrophically different. Therefore, the regulations actually end up perverting the incentives that would naturally end up governing the relationship between the board and the shareholders, between the management and the board itself. Because it becomes impossibly hard to end up actually throwing a bunch of them out and seeing the kind of change that a dynamic market needs to end up actually seeing. So I think the first and foremost thing is, if this is something, if you really wanted a radical idea, to end up actually allowing, reducing the regulatory burden and cholesterol that exists, allow for shareholders and management and shareholders on the board to genuinely decide the compact that actually ends up existing between two of them as of now. Because in a free and liquid market, if you don't like the way a company is actually run, leave that company and actually take your money elsewhere, because money ultimately is what talks. And we've seen this happen in numerous cases. When anyone has doubts about the veracity of accounts, about the authenticity of management, people end up actually dumping the stock. And that's a natural consequence. But suddenly, people are afraid when stock prices end up actually falling, because they believe it's emblematic of what's happening in the nation. It's not. A single stock price or someone actually doing something wrong is not tar to end up painting the entire nation. But yet, if you look at the media narratives that come out as of now, those are the kind of false sequences we end up actually making. And that is why it's so hard to end up actually seeing that kind of change. So transparency is to get the incentives back in place, reduce the burden that exists, make it simpler for people to do, make it easier for people to end up actually replacing management, make it easier for companies to end up actually buying out badly run companies and do that. Let market forces play the role that market forces have traditionally played for eons for that matter. We've seen this happen in popular uprisings throughout history. Every revolution has had its seed in the discontent of the common people or of the keys of power, who believe that the current person who was ruling didn't have the right or the authenticity to rule. China is actually a fantastic example. Every emperor of China had the mandate of heaven, but the mandate of heaven always belonged to the person who had the biggest army. And the moment that large army couldn't actually keep the nation together, that mantle would automatically pass to another person. They've seen that kind of creative destruction end up actually playing out. And if we were to go back to something that's truly simple, something that's truly matters, I think that is the kind of radical change that we can end up seeing. Will we see that? The answer is most probably no. I think it's going to be extremely hard to have these sort of far left field ideas. But I think that's a germ of a thought to end up actually beginning to look at the current set of regulations that exist and end up breaking it down. And to the current US dispensation that's there as of now, outside of what they've done to make the English language simpler and make pronouns far more attuned to what you end up actually seeing visually for that matter, I think they've done a great job about bringing out the fact that over-regulation is actually a curse on business, over-regulation is actually a curse on what ends up actually happening. If you look at it in India, you will not have a single promoter or person end up actually abusing the regulator the way Musk actually abused the SEC. And the way Musk actually did what he did on Twitter to the stock price, did on X or Twitter, whatever it's called, with regard to the stock price of Tesla to the stock price of X. You would never actually end up actually seeing that happen because our systems are so strong, the reaction of the people is so visceral that these sort of outliers end up actually getting cut. But that being said, we may not be a country that actually creates an outlier like Musk. And Musk is actually created amongst the largest amount of shareholder value that's actually been created.
Yeah, Siddarth, you're right and you're not right. Because in the US, the very fact that this surfaced and became an issue, there are banana republics where there are crony capitalists. These things are not allowed to surface at all.
100%. But
and so we don't know what is really happening. Yeah. So there might be Musks in those banana republics, but the things doesn't surface. It's just snuff.
So, which way now, there's also the question of the compact that happens between shareholders and management, because any shareholder in a company would obviously require of management transparency in their operations, what actually ends up happening. In a banana republic, it is the strong man of yore. It is my way or the highway, and normally the highway has never been built because the money has actually been pilfered.
Correct.
I had a couple of points. One on the US point. While I believe that the US is in decline and it's getting worse rather than better every day, the place from where they started in terms of their governance and their institutional robustness is extremely high. The ability for somebody like an Elon Musk to even come out and challenge the President of the United States and continue to run his business, to challenge his regulators, is a sign of institutional robustness and maturity that I don't think would happen. I could probably count on one hand the number of countries where that kind of interaction would happen and a businessman would not get pulled up or disappeared in a certain way. But the larger point I had, where I had a slightly different opinion than Siddarth, was on this idea that the promoters in India today are completely unshakable out of their companies, and that the system is ossified and very, very nepotistic in that sense. And I would again, there's a quote from somebody I love where he says, India may not make the greatest picture, but it's a really compelling movie. And if you were to apply that framework to this point, and you think about India 15 years ago, and the kind of excesses that promoters were getting away with, we are better today. I look at this lens from a banking perspective when we think about lending to larger and mid-sized companies, and you're often evaluating some of these finer points in a credit evaluation. I do believe that we're much better today, and things like the IBC, various other system-level initiatives we have, and we have seen over the last 5-6 years certain bad actors being moved out of their own companies, and it's not 2 or 3, I would say it's half a dozen large companies where some of this kind of necessary reinvention has happened. Is it enough? No. Are there still gaps where this phenomenon of independent directors being quiet and promoters running their own companies like fiefdoms? It still happens, but I believe that we're getting better. It's just that you can't look at it every 2 years and expect progress in India. You have to look at it every 5 or 7 years. And on that lens, probably we're better.
So I think just one thing on that, Jay, actually, with regard to one question that I've often actually asked this to banks, since you're a banker yourself, you'll be able to answer it. We've had very good banks that have actually stood the test of time in this country for years. We've had regulations come and go and change from like 60s, 70s to what we're seeing as of now. But the best run banks did not actually wait for the regulator to wake up and tell them how best to end up actually running a bank. The best run businesses didn't wait for someone else to come and tell them, this is what you have to do. The best run institutions always ended up actually setting standards that other people would end up actually looking up to. My father often actually tells me, and Mr. Murthy also has told us many times, the Infosys annual report used to actually be sold on the streets of Mumbai because of the quality of the content that they ended up actually creating, because they ended up actually setting standards for what they've actually created. I think when you end up actually saying that way, the best run companies end up actually becoming something to aspire to for the rest. Regulations is just a way to end up actually playing catch up. So while we have actually seen banks end up actually improving, we've gone past the entire era of phone banking, and I think phone banking, the euphemism that used to exist about 10, 15 years back versus the technological innovation that exists as of now. Those are some of the reasons why we ended up actually seeing the kind of morass that ended up actually coming into the ecosystem. But even during the worst times, we still had fantastic companies. It just goes to show that fantastic companies will remain fantastic companies, whether they're in the largest country or whether they are in a banana republic. I think the role that regulation has to end up playing, regulations can't bring down the largest companies to the lowest common denominator. Regulations actually need to elevate everyone else to what the highest aspirations and the higher echelons need to end up actually being. And even though the amount, I think I spent about close to 20 minutes actually abusing the regulators, actually the Indian regulators do actually have amongst the hardest jobs. Anything that goes well happens despite the regulation. Anything that goes bad happens because of the regulation. And that is unfortunately a cross that a large number of them need to end up actually bearing. And contrary to belief, and after speaking to a large number of regulators, the regulator is not the all-powerful, omnipotent God that people usually end up actually making it out to be, for that matter. The regulator at most times is actually, unfortunately, a ringmaster in charge of a circus. They don't know when the clowns are going to come out, when the trapeze artist is going to fall, or when the lion decides to end up actually having a snack. Their job is to end up actually reacting as much as it goes to end up actually playing the rules of the playground. And I think as a populace, we have grown far too comfortable relying on the regulator to end up telling us what to do, as opposed to actually looking at what the best practices are, decide to end up actually adopting it yourselves. I think that's actually been one of our failings.
Yeah, but Siddarth, what you're saying is, if I go back to the pre-1956 Act, we had a situation of the kind you are today propagating. Contract between the shareholder and the management and the people who are running the business. And there was a great deal of freedom. There was very little regulation if I go to the 1913 Act and so on. And companies could do just about anything they wished to, and they did those things. And then we entered, as it were, in our own country, a socialist era, and we became progressively more prescriptive. There were certain reasons also for which we became prescriptive, but we had long passed that socialist era. But the government, and I'm not talking only of the regulators, I'm saying the government's own thinking, and today's government also in our country, its own thinking is detailed prescriptive conduct.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is that should not be the case. If that should not be the case, why would it be happening? Does the government not have common sense that this is not good and we shouldn't do it?
Because nobody loses their job by building upon what was already done in the past if it's not broken.
But is the government afraid of losing their jobs if they...
The government, unlike the government similar to directors, actually faces its constituents on a periodic basis, and they have to attest to them whether what they've done does end up standing the test of time or not. That being said, I think, like I said previously, a large number of people equate a scam with what happens with a commentary on actually the government. We made false equivalences all the time over. Businesses happen, and there are some businesses who believe they are equivalent to the nation, and these kind of false equivalences are created. They're not. They're actually separate. They are distinct, for that matter. Businesses come, businesses go. They may fail, they may succeed. That happens. What happens in the nation carries on its own course itself. You can't end up actually marrying the two. They may feed off each other and be synergistic, but they do actually have independent courses, they do actually have independent paths that they end up actually following also. Yeah. And the India that existed in the pre-1956 Companies Act era versus the India that actually exists in the 2025 era as now is actually markedly different.
Totally.
We've seen marked difference. So that's why we have the aspirations of a $10 trillion economy with the regulations of a $500 billion economy. And that has become an absolute drag on the ability for people to end up actually operating. If you think about it, in the world of startups, where I actually come from, we had an epidemic of the best founders actually leaving the country, going and setting up their business in the US. Think about it. Their team was Indian, their management was Indian, their entire business was in India. Everyone was here, but their holding company was in Singapore. The largest startup exit that happened in this country, which was the sale of Flipkart, was not the sale of an Indian company. It was the sale of a Singapore company. It's only very recently, after a substantial amount of changes, some amount of liberalization, and the fact that our capital markets, or rather, let me change that, startup and private investors believe that the capital markets are now more forgiving of loss-making entities and startups actually looking to invest over here, looking to end up actually listing over here. Did we actually see a trend where a good chunk of our unicorns who actually flipped overseas have actually come back? At one point in time, more than half of India's unicorns, $1 billion plus valued private entities, were actually domiciled overseas. Even some of the IPOs that are in the process as of now, these were actually foreign companies, paid a large amount of tax to end up actually coming back. So it has actually shown that these over-prescription does end up actually paying a price. The price is the flight of talent. And the moment we end up actually rectifying that, talent does want to end up actually coming back and end up actually creating value far, far closer to home. And numerous people have actually said that it's purely regulation and the lack of flexibility. Even now as a private company, if you look at what happened with one of the companies that's going to IPO as of now, promoters in the country can't get ESOPs. The simple reason, the term promoter also is like a bygone era term. The new age word is actually a founder. The previous understanding always was the promoter is a majority shareholder in the company, normally holding 50 plus. There is no reason whatsoever for the promoter to actually get ESOPs in the company. We now have founders who are in charge of management, who end up holding 10, 8, 9% of their company. For them to end up, and these are fantastic engineers, great coders, but for them to get a higher stake in their company, they can't go down the ESOP route. They have to resort to exotic financial engineering generated by consultants that ends up actually exposing them to media scrutiny, ends up actually exposing them to all sorts of issues from a regulatory perspective. The question to ask is therefore, what is the issue actually allowing shareholders to decide if I wish to reward my management or the promoter of this company with more stock, why am I actually barred? what public loss is actually faced. And that's an example. So when you have those kind of systems, and for someone who wants to accumulate the value that they've ended up actually creating for themselves, which is a perfectly valid human incentive for anyone to end up and emotion for anyone to end up having, they have to end up actually flipping overseas just to get that kind of flexibility. And that just shows that the overprescription, there is a cost to pay. The drag on the economy is actually real.
Sure. Yeah, you want to add anything
On-
before we ask the audience?
On this topic, so
Or any topic.
I agree.
Broadly, the topic which is here on
there's,
top of our heads. Yeah.
there's definitely always room for more agility, faster turnaround time, flexibility to founders, and India can do more. That said, if I look at this example of today, the Grows and the Lens cards and the Paytms and the Phone Pays are flipping back and listing in India, hiring in India, scaling in India. That's not a coincidence. I think that's a culmination of 30 years of reasonably good policy from the likes of SEBI, from the likes of Reserve Bank, etc., that have, with mistakes along the way and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, made a desirable local ecosystem, a guardrailed local ecosystem. If you think about the protections for retail investors, you think about the way IPOs are governed, etc., etc. Now it is lucrative to be here. And so we are in a life cycle to get to where we need to. India is today per capita GDP $2,800 income. If you look around the world at other countries at $2,800 to $3,500 income, you would see countries like Kenya, you would see countries like Indonesia, you would see not much ahead of us, countries like Turkey. And I would argue that the relative sophistication of our regulators by that benchmark, we're moving in the right direction. And we're creating a local regulatory framework that is reasonable. Even if you look at a recent regulation on capital that lending institutions have to set aside for unsecured lending being increased, in the moment, it looked maybe a little prescriptive. A year and a half later, looking at how the system reacted to it, probably a good idea. And so it's always about finding the balance. In my day job, I often find myself exacerbated at some piece of regulation or interaction. But from a macro policy perspective, you can't get these things wrong, and so you have to guardrail.
Okay, thanks. Friends, I'm not sure we quite
Ajay, just
addressed
one
the
thing,
question on top.
Sorry. Change the continuity. Huh?
Yeah. But would any of you like either to ask a question or to contribute to this conversation? Yeah, somebody at the back, it's a lady, yeah.
Hi. You touched upon a little bit of shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism, but we also see disruption of the top-down model on which companies and boards are based in some sectors. For instance, you have DAOs or decentralized autonomous organizations now, which although are smaller in scale and are limited to, let's say, decentralized finance or crypto spaces. But do you see such disruptive models coming in beyond these sectors, or do you see disruptions to the top-down board structures evolving in the next few years, let's say in a decade or in 2 decades?
Good question.
I think, yeah?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think not every problem in the world is actually a technology problem. I don't think socio-political human problems can end up actually being solved through technology itself. So the principles of a DAO, for example, where it's actually autonomous, it's decentralized, everyone has an equal say depending on the amount of work they end up actually putting for that matter, is actually fantastic. It is, by theory, not capable of capture, but I think a large amount of the value destruction that's actually been transpired in the space as of now has actually emanated from the fact that people have actually captured a large amount of that. And it points to two important factors. Number one, the number of people who have the right to vote versus the number of people who end up exercising the vote, there's a massive divergence that happens between the two itself. Two, the concept of control is not contingent on a 50% majority ends up actually coming in. Even a small percentage, if it's actually captured, can end up actually constituting control. And we've actually seen numerous cases of DAOs, especially, and a lot of things in the crypto world end up happening, where a small group of people actually come together, collectively scheme, they can end up actually rigging the price. And the price, and unfortunately the consequences are actually faced by everyone who's actually there. Those kind of prove the point that regulation is actually needed, but it's a right scale regulation, the right scale regulation for what factors that end up actually happening. Which is why regulation is also required to be periodically refreshed. Regulation is also meant to reflect the aspirations and the activities as well as the elevated conscience of the people they end up actually working with as of now, which is even the point I've been trying to make with India as well. We've had highly antiquated regulations which are tightly controlled, and we've actually missed out on numerous waves because of that. Because the best innovators don't want to be prescribed every single aspect of their being or every single aspect of their operations. They actually prefer the freedom that actually ends up coming in. But will we move to some of the principles of a DAO-type architecture when it actually comes to this? Yes, but that's purely contingent on people actually deciding whether it's worth voting or not. Even in the session before ours, where the mutual fund managers were actually on stage, they were compelled to vote by regulation. I think that's actually, quite frankly, as a manager of an AIF who also has to end up voting on all the matters that end up actually coming before us, we didn't need a piece of regulation to tell us to exercise what is our basic fiduciary duty to our investors, as well as our role actually as a shareholder, for that matter. So I think that's the kind of change we have to do. If we have the corporate consciousness of the average person, it's unfortunately not that high. And the consequence of that is even people with a small stake can end up actually controlling the company. It's a case of the tail wagging the dog. So the technology solutions offered by the crypto worlds through DAOs, etc., it's not a technology problem again. I think it actually boils down to the heart of whether people actually give a damn enough to actually end up casting a vote or not. And I think the social compact there is fairly certain. Unless you actually raise your voice, unless you actually cast your vote, you will end up actually suffering the consequences of your inaction. So I think,
Okay.
yeah, that's actually that.
Okay. Any other contribution to our topic? Yeah, sure. Damodara.
I echo what you said, Nawshir, at the beginning, that you and your two fellow panelists do not belong to the same generation.
I can't even understand half of what they say. Yeah.
But I must say you made an attempt. Anyway. And you said your daughter was older than them. I think my grandson is getting closer to their age, but let that pass. I'm going back to the subject. And there are two elements to this, boards of the future. One is, are the boards going to be constituted in the manner in which they're presently constituted?
Yes.
Are you going to see not just incremental changes, but very fundamental changes in the way the boards are constituted? It's one thought. The second, which concerns me and has been concerning me for a while now, is what do boards do? What is the content of what the boards do?
Correct.
Today, the quarterly meetings have, if I may give an example, become like the Friday evening meetings of the pathology department of the hospitals. So the quarter that's dead, some work is done on that. You're telling people why somebody died, what was the, proximate cause for the death, etc. And you're not spending enough time looking at what is going to happen in the next quarter, the next year, the future. Are boards of tomorrow going to spend much less time discussing the dead quarter and looking ahead at what they're supposed to do, because that's their job, leading the effort at looking at the future, etc. For that, do we need different kinds of boards, or should it be more of the same? That's my issue. I'm not saying for a moment, send away all the old people. Of course, I have left all boards, so have you. So even if a decision is taken, send away all the old people. We will not pay a price at a personal level. But surely you need some of that experience, that wisdom, coexisting in boardrooms with young people who are very willing to challenge status quo, the older people. And I see a direct relationship. Older people are more comfortable with status quo. Younger people challenge it a little more. So do we need to introduce that? And hence, are we looking at change with continuity, change in the structure, change in the content, and yet continuity in terms of a non-disruptive change towards the boards of the future.
Yeah, actually, my view on what both of the topics, points that you just made is, the fundamental purpose of boards has been and should continue to be looking, as you said, into the future. Because the strategy is the heart of what a board ought to do. Unfortunately, in our country, and I've sat on boards and been involved with companies for several decades now, there is no understanding of what strategy is. Most strategy presentations or discussions, not presentations, are more of the same. Our strategy is we are going to grow top line at 10% CAGR, bottom line at 15% CAGR. That's not strategy, that's more of the same. Strategy is what kind of company would we like to be 10 years from now? That is strategy. Very few companies ever discuss this. Very few even promoters apply their minds to this. So that is at the core. And in order to do that, now my view is to look into the future, because the future is hazy and foggy. It's not how much knowledge you have of the current business. The knowledge of the current business, your top leadership, executive leadership must bring. It's not the job of the board to bring knowledge of the current business. The job of the board is to bring their wisdom, and you used that word rightly, to bring their wisdom to look at what management thinks our company ought to be. And the wisdom is not knowledge of the business. Wisdom is seeing, can we become that? Is it desirable to become that? What will be the world, what will the world be like then if we are like that, we are that sort of company 8 years from now or 5 years or 10 years from now? So that requires wisdom, and that is, as you rightly said, it's not necessarily that all old people are imbued with wisdom. Most are not. But it does help to be older to possess wisdom. So that is my own understanding of this. And therefore your point on what will be, what should be a composition of a board, and I think that was your first point. Now, I've often heard this thing. The composition of a board should be, there should be a finance guy, there should be a legal guy, there should be a guy who understands the business. The message being, we don't think our CFO is competent or our CTO is competent. We need a guy on top who is looking over his shoulder and saying, this guy is making financial blunders, or this guy doesn't know technology, I know technology more than him. I don't think a board should be a collection of competencies which management must possess. Then you have a problem with the kind of management you have. If you want a director to be looking over the shoulder of your leadership. And I go back to what I said, therefore, that mainly in directors you need wisdom to be able to temper the enthusiasm of young executives. And many companies have come a cropper because the promoter often is, has often been the culprit here. People are enthusiastic. In my own experience, impairment after impairment, acquisitions done. Senior management that thought this is a great thing to acquire a business, 7, 8 years down the road, it has to be impaired. That's because the directors did not exercise wisdom. You know, there has to be a yin and yang. The management brings enthusiasm, they bring optimism. But there is often an over-optimism, and it is for the board to temper that over-optimism. But I've often seen boards applauding over-optimistic behavior. And then 7 or 8 years down the road, the consequences of that hit the bottom line. But you know, you said about young people and old people and all. Actually, if you see, I looked forward and I said the role of good boards will be making the purpose of the company stakeholders, not only the shareholders. But if you listen to my two young colleagues, they often mention the market forces. They meant capital market forces. They're only talking of one stakeholder, the fellow who gives money to the company. So we can see how the young and old people Actually, the young, old people are sometimes more radical than the young, and the young are quite content to have the same broad this thing. I know they'll argue with me, but they don't have enough time now to make their point.
Both of us are waiting. We have eyes on that.
So no. So I'll tell you quite seriously. Yeah.
Rising out of what you said just now, which is, in the beginning, God ran the world. Then we trusted the state to run the world. Then the state failed, we trusted the markets to run the world.
Yeah.
I think somewhere God is saying, give it back, I'll do a better job than you guys have done. That's one. My second comment is this, in a very simple proposition, managements run companies, the board should ensure that the management runs it well. They have nothing more to do.
Yes. You know, you mentioned God. Actually, the current Companies Act, I don't know how many of you have read the fourth schedule, which is the code for independent directors. It's got a remarkably progressive clause in the Act. And I'll give you verbatim what the clause says. It says, there's an error in it. This is independent directors shall ensure the balancing of conflicting interests of all stakeholders. That's a remarkably enlightened phrase. To balance, not to give respect to balance the interests, not the rights. So the Act does not talk of rights. Harmony, that is God. Because even God finds it difficult to keep everyone happy. And the Companies Act is expecting, and only the independent directors, not the rest of the fellows in the company, to ensure this happens. And I've been an independent director, now I've stopped being it, for many, many decades, and I never made sure this happened. I tried, totally unsuccessfully, because all my colleagues thought I was nuts to talk about the environment things. In fact, I had 3 chairmen who told me, this is our activist director. They used to call me that. But we need to, I think, eventually, because the way the capitalism is now destroying the world, it's a question now increasingly of the survival of human beings. We may have a lot of money in the banks as we are all taken away to be burned or buried respectively. So I don't know what the future holds. This is not my wisdom or anything. It's just, as a person at my age, I worry about what I have bequeathed to my children and grandchildren and their children. It's not a good world, I think, that lies in front of us. And I think a lot of responsibility rests on this generation to rectify the terrible errors my and my predecessor generations have done.
I think it's surprising that all the assets rest with the older generation, the liabilities come to the newer generation.
That's inevitable because the population shrinks. We become liabilities as we get older. So you have got to carry us on your fewer and fewer shoulders. You're right.
You heard that statement. We haven't inherited the earth from our parents, we borrowed it from our
Yes.
There you are. You're right. You're right.
Yes.
So with that, we still have 1 minute if anyone wants to say something. Otherwise, we'll do whatever. Yeah. Mohandas, good.
No, I want to ask the members. You see, the most important thing today is the pace of change.
Yeah.
Are boards capable of understanding the pace of change and looking at the future with some kind of confidence to adjust to the pace of change?
Yeah.
Now, this is a very, very, very important thing the boards have to discuss. I want to ask all of them whether what kind of board should we create so they understand the pace of change, enormous pace of change.
Correct. Yeah, you want to?
I think the composition of a board is extremely important to find that balance. And I completely agree with you that many boards today maybe don't understand the pace of change. The composition is skewed in one way or another, and that creates an issue. But again, as a student of history, sometimes I'm often the wet cloth in the room. Sometimes too much change can also disrupt and break a system. So maybe as young people, we should take a step back and accept the wisdom of the board members that push us back and say, be a little more careful.
Slow. Yeah,
And which often happens.
yeah.
I think the role for the role for humans in the boards of the future is going to be fairly limited. I think one thing that's becoming fairly obvious is the limitation of our faculties is also being reached at a highly accelerated rate as of now, for that matter. And I think as to what you said, sir, the only person who will end up actually managing a board and the regulator's definition of a board is actually God. I think AI and technology are the closest we can end up actually coming to the divine itself. So I think that after a while, the role that these end up actually playing for some of these functions will end up increasing. And it's not just as a substitution for humans, but to end up actually helping them forecast some of these elements that are fairly unknown as of now. So the only way to manage the unknowns is to end up encompassing a large amount of the current institutional knowledge and use that to end up and battle testing that against variables that may or may not arise in the future. I think humans do a terrible. I think there's some saying or there's some rule or something. We end up actually overestimating the immediate future and we end up actually underestimating the far future. I think that sort of combination of nearsightedness and foresightedness is something that is actually peculiar to us and something that can actually be mitigated through technology that comes in. Not as a overall substitution to humans, but I think as an accelerant to what we end up actually seeing. So I think that may be the future constitution of a board. Now, I don't know how AI is going to meet the fit and proper definition that normally encompasses what every board ends up actually coming at, but I'm fairly certain the regulators will have a field time debating that and actually crafting that whenever that comes in.
Mohan, this is flashing away, time's up, time's up. So time's up.
No, I just wanted to make a contribution.
Thank you.
You know, in the wisdom of our ancients, there is what is called eternal truths. That will continue, which is Shruti. And then there are constitutional, not constitutional, there are relevant changes you make which are for the time or the purpose, which is called Smriti. So I think you cannot now throw out everything that was wrong in the past.
No.
You have to keep, and which is truth, like it is the eternal truth. The law of gravity is eternal. They have to stay constant. And you have to evolve. So I don't think the question of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or as you say, AI will replace everything and then nothing is to be done. I think there will be a role for both. And I think that's where what Mr. Mirza said.
They're not talking of throwing out babies, they're talking of throwing out the old men.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm trying
Chalo,
to
we'll have to come to an end because otherwise there'll be another revolution in the room. So thank you all very much. And thanks to my two co-panelists. Jai and Siddarth, thank you all.
So thank you, Mr. Kotak, Mr. Mirza, and Mr. Pai for sharing your perspective on this important subject. May now request Mr. Damodaran to please present a memento to each panelist. Till then, can we have a huge round of applause for all our panelists and for this wonderful session that we've had so far. So on behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nanni Kali, a Mahindra initiative.